So,
Should we proceed?
let's proceed.
Ooh, Terry?
Earlier, you described the difference between partnership and dominator cultures. How?
Oh, yeah.
First-
Should we talk about those a bit more?
Yeah, because that's where the book goes on afterwards. So, first of all, there were dominator cultures, like, say, troops of chimps, pre-mushroom. He calls them pre-mushroom societies in the book. They just run around and kill each other.
Shit ever.
They run around and kill each other and don't even speak very well while they're doing it, and their visual acuity sucks. So they're not even doing it very well. Then they discover mushrooms. They become feminized. They become good at talking to each other. They become empathetic. They have lots of group
Bunch of
sex.
soy boy cucks running around, not killing each other.
Yeah, they stop killing each other though, because they're now mushroom society. They're in communicate.
That's got to be an evolutionary advantage.
Yeah, they're in communication
Not
with the
killing
great
each other.
goddess. And they become partnership societies. They become largely matriarchal, although at the same time
Yeah.
non-hierarchical.
Yeah,
And
flat.
they worship the great goddess. They are
Well,
of
they
one
are still
planetary
hierarchical,
vegetable
but-
mind.
Yes, but they're not strictly hierarchical in the ways that we might think of, like a chimp troop or something.
No.
And
because-
of
well,
one
they've
mind,
started the process of
synchronized,
into higher being.
synchronized with the mushroom matrix.
Yeah.
Essentially.
He's got a few buzzwords that he likes. The vegetable matrix, the mushroom matrix, the planetary consciousness.
The goddess, the transcendent other. Yeah. So having said that, so let's talk a bit about this distinction, right?
What's interesting?
Okay, to me, sorry, go on.
No, continue.
See, here's the thing, right? This very much resembles the philosophy of Plato, because Plato, he harkens back in his ideas of the Republic to basically like the essence or the ideal form of society was this, like static, hierarchical, rigid class structure of a society that existed at some point in the past. And that's the Platonic ideal of society, right? So it's this idea, this fundamental idea that there is this perfect way in which a society can exist. And it existed in the past. And the logic, therefore, is that we should do things to like get back towards that state. It's just, he's essentially taking a psychedelic spin on Plato's underlying logic. So in a way, McKenna is the psychedelic Plato. That's what I got out of it.
Interesting. I viewed it slightly differently in that I don't think he's entirely consistent in his views. So, like, for example, he views the Christian idea of us all being sinners and needing saving as something from dominator culture, as something very unnatural and something destructive. But I can't help but see parallels with that in how he describes the relationship between dominator societies and partnership societies, because we are fundamentally dominator societies, or we incline that way, because pre-mushroom societies went in that direction. And without access to the mushroom, we go back to being dominator societies. We degrade, in a way. And that says to me, that mirrors that idea of us all being sinners fundamentally, unless we are saved. In the context of Christianity by Jesus Christ, in the context of Terrence McKenna by getting fried.
Yes, that's interesting. That's interesting.
He's less radical than I think he felt himself to be in that respect. I see it as a...
Yeah, interesting. That's a good way to think about it. What do I think? He certainly wants to have some degree of return to the past.
Yeah.
Like things, it is the classic. I see this a lot in like the indigenous context of like, okay, like pre-colonial societies were like indigenous Australia, like pre-colonial societies were like this Garden of Eden or whatever down here in Australia. No predators, just mob just running around, being peaceful and all this sort of stuff, or whatever, everything is just cool, right? So we should go back to those things and those values. But I also see this like there's always this like the good old days, right? It's even make America great again. There's this kind of thing in human psychology of like looking back into like some idealized past and thinking we like right now is bad and we're heading towards the end of the world if we keep this up, moral degradation or whatever. Even Thomas Sowell, as much as I love Thomas Sowell, like he makes the same fallacy at times. And therefore we need to like look back to whether it's like the Reagan era or like the pre-JFK era or like pre-colonial, or like for Plato it was like pre-democracy, and for Terrence it's mushroom partnership society is like the zenith of human achievement, and now we need to take this modern world and like revive that, right? So I'm never convinced that it really was that good in the past.
No, there's almost always a golden age, and it's almost never now.
Yeah, and it's like, are you sure it was that good back then?
I mean, I sometimes wonder whether people think that today, or whichever time they happen to be living in, is uniquely bad because you have to live when you live. Like that, the problems
And
now we
sometimes it
don't know
sucks
how
being
they
alive.
end, and they're much more imminent than problems we read about that were present in, say, the 15th century or whenever. So because of that immediacy, we think, oh, things have never been this bad.
And people always think it's the end of the world. Like, like the Rig Vedas and like the Christian, like apocalyptic Christianity or apocalyptic Islam. Like everybody always thinks it's the end of the world. And it's like, this is why everybody should go and read David Deutsch's The Beginning of Infinity, because like, hey, maybe we're not. Maybe this shit can just go on indefinitely into the future. And all we got to do is like make sure that we live in a society that can solve problems indefinitely into the future. And we're not living in the end times. In fact, we might be living, if we're at the beginning of infinity and we're on the edge of infinity, then maybe actually now is the best time to be alive if you're in a country like Australia or whatever. And the only better time to be alive is tomorrow.
When we live in peace and harmony with the vegetable intelligence. According to the dictates laid out by Terrence McKenna.
More people take psychedelic mushrooms. Global cookedness.
Global cookedness. So, the problem that McKenna lays out, our society now is terrible. There was a golden age, we're not living in it. We are living in an egocentric, degrading, psilocybin deficient, neurotic, sexually repressed hellscape.
Capitalist marketing garbage with television fascist brainwashing everyone.
Exactly.
Which
and the
Jack
reason why
would
we are
actually
here...
agree with, wouldn't you, Jack?
I don't disagree with all of them.
Jack and Noam Chomsky would both agree with Terrence McKenna on this point.
I wholeheartedly agree with Terrence McKenna. There is absolutely no daylight between his views and my own. So he sets the problem out in this way. I'll read a quote and we can go from there. So remember, first, Dominator society. We had mushrooms. We had partnership societies, which were good. Then we stopped having mushrooms again because of climate change in the African Eden, which meant that humans had to leave. We migrated away because there stopped being as many mushrooms there. He says, in Shamanism as a Social Catalyst, that's the name of the chapter, I believe that the natural psychedelic compounds acted as feminizing agents that tempered and civilized the egocentric values of the solitary hunter individual with the feminine concern for child rearing and group survival. So as we can see, when you're in communion with the mushrooms, you have these feminine concerns for child rearing and group survival. It leads to this cooperative society, the Eden. When we lose connection with mushrooms to the transcendent other, we regress to this state of the solitary hunter individual. We regress to dominator values and dominator societies. So much of human history really has been trying to recapture this lost Eden. And he regards it as just that. He thinks of the Garden of Eden story as one of the foundational stories of our culture, as an allegory for losing this Eden, this wonderful time when we lived in partnership societies on the African savannah where Stropharia cubensis grew abundantly. You could just pick from the ground your ticket to the transcendent other, eat it, commune, have group sex, have the best life imaginable. But climate change ruined it, and humans migrated from Africa, and during the migration were in constant search for something to fill the void left by psychedelic mushrooms. In some places it was successful. So he notes in South America and Central America, there are a lot of naturally occurring psychedelic compounds, which explains why everyone there lives in bliss. Because they have access to vegetable intelligence. Because you can go and eat magic mushrooms. You can smoke DMT. You can drink ayahuasca. However, in other places, like in Europe, for example, the reason why the West is so awful is because Europeans had alcohol, and that is the dominator drug. He describes it as the perfect dominator drug. We can get into that
with
shortly.
a cadre of other dominator drugs, but alcohol being the big dog.
The dominator drug. So, I've got some good quotes. What do you want to talk about first? Do you want to talk about the difference between dominator and partnership societies in a bit more detail? We can go into why the West sucks. We can go into the path out of Eden that humans took, and we can trace the societies that retained partnership values as opposed to dominator values. There are a lot of different directions we can take this in.
Well, okay. Quick recap on the dominator thing, right? I guess essentially, like, just think of all the things that hippies don't like. Okay, hippies don't like the patriarchy. Hippies don't like oil. Hippies don't like mining. Hippies don't like commercial television. Hippies don't like neoliberalism. Hippies don't like the 80s. Okay, just think of all of these things. Okay, those are all the things that a dominator society is. That is your dominator society. Okay,
pretty much. I guess you can ultimately think.
Am I being unfair here? Like, seriously?
No, as a good heuristic, you can think of dominator society is based on hierarchy and a feeling of powerlessness. If you feel powerless, you seek to accrue power so that you can exert that power over others and protect yourself.
He does this like stupid psychoanalyst, like that twist. You're like, you're acting this way to like compensate for this neurotic, like unconscious deficit that you have. So you seek power because you feel powerless. Mm-hmm. I think that's a bunch of bullshit. Because like, just take just take Putin, for example. I don't think he feels powerless. I think he feels very fucking powerful. And I think he feels perfectly entitled to be powerful. And I think he'll fucking kill you and do whatever the fuck he wants. Because he's powerful and he knows he's powerful. You don't have to play these like psychoanalytic games. Like, some people just like power. Which also brings us on to the other point, which is ego. He brings it back to ego a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And these are like the drugs like alcohol, caffeine, or whatever, they pump your ego. Cocaine pumps your ego. That's why the 80s, all about cocaine, right? Pump the ego, you get the money, you get the power, you get the women, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's ego. So any of this like ego, high bravado, grab them by the pussy, that sort of shit, all that dominator culture.
Yeah, basically.
Mushrooms obliterate your ego. DMT obliterate the ego. Put you in contact with the mushroom matrix, feminine goddess.
Yeah. Interestingly, he talks about dominated cultures as evolutionary dead ends and of partnership societies as
Because the
being
logic is...
the only way to evolve, which is interesting because at least if you look around today, dominated cultures have thoroughly outcompeted partnership societies, if partnership societies existed in the first place.
Dominated.
It's there in the name.
Jack. So here's the issue, right? He proposes that and it works from this silly, again, it's the end times complex. He has not escaped the silly, immature end time complex that all these people have. These bloody eco-fascists who want to stop us from having oil in our cars, all right? Who think that the world is ending. The world's not ending, people. The world is not ending, all right? Relax. Okay, so the thing is, he goes, okay, dominated cultures, it leads to nuclear war, it leads to this massive climate catastrophe, right? That we're gonna enter this climate catastrophe in like 20 years, and we're gonna be entering this climate catastrophe in 20 years since the 70s, right? So clearly, this dominator Western culture crap is going to lead us into disaster. However, he's proposing that this inflection point from partnership cultures to dominated cultures and the overthrow of the mushies must have taken place many thousands of years ago, at least 10 or 15,000 years. Mm-hmm. So that means this competition and this increasing outcompeting of partnership cultures by dominated cultures has been going on for thousands and thousands of years, and yet they haven't destroyed everything yet.
I mean, it could be a function of technology. I mean, we've only now hit the point where technology is increasing it in complexity,
sufficiently powerful enough technology.
Yeah, I mean, it seems almost an exponential rate of technological increase now. So it might be that we've only just recently reached the point where we really can eliminate all life on Earth, say with nuclear weapons, or with, say, how dominator culture is operating, that if things do not change at all, then there probably is going to be a climate catastrophe.
I'm getting into arguing with McKenna. I should be fairly representing and explaining his point of view. I just think that this dichotomy that he's drawn up is, one, it's not even real, and two, it's not coherent. We're not living in the end times.
Yeah, and for a number of reasons. I think, one, if you're going to follow a purely evolutionary argument, dominated cultures are competitively superior to partnership societies. I'm not sure that partnership societies ever existed in the way that he describes them. Maybe in, say, small pre-agricultural bands of humans.
Well, as far as we can tell, I mean, you don't even have to go to pre-agriculture. You could just go to the Amazon or something, especially before too much modern interference, from outsiders. Did Amazonian tribes until the recent incursion of Westerners into their lives, like Terrence, did they ever have
before Terrence showed up
and ruined everything? Did they ever have intertribal conflict whilst they were also taking psychedelics? They probably did. I mean, I don't want to make any sweeping statements here, but I'm guessing that they occasionally had fights between tribes.
And they definitely have access to psychedelic compounds.
And they definitely have shamans.
Yeah. So I get, if I'm going to be very generous to Terrence and his idea that dominator societies are an evolutionary regression and evolutionarily inferior to partnership societies, you could say that the reason why we are living in the end times, if you accept that premise, is because we are following dominator patterns of civilization. And if we didn't, then we wouldn't be in this case. But again, that brings up the problem of, dominator cultures dominated the non-dominator cultures.
Okay. Secondly, if you go now, some people disagree with the book, but if you go and read something like Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, he brings some reasonable evidence forward that says actually violence, death due to violence, things like homicide, and even deaths due to war have been declining throughout history, especially in countries like Western countries, and these countries has basically become more like things like democracy and capitalism, all the things that lefties don't like, right? These things tend towards people not killing one another on the street, and in fact are actually very, very peaceful societies. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence that other societies at other points in history had very high rates of violence. And in particular, there's one particular form of violence, and it's called reactive violence. Reactive violence as opposed to like, I can't remember what the exact term is, but like, I suppose like coordinated violence. Reactive violence is just like, oh, I get angry at somebody because they push in front of me in the line, so I punch them in the head or something, And so chimps are really reactively violent. Humans, very, very low levels of reactive violence compared to chimps and other mammals. But even within human societies, like you can measure reactive violence basically by looking at like crime rates, and societies that are like quote unquote more dominator styles tend to have very, very low rates of reactive violence. So
yeah, well then that brings up another problem with dividing all human societies into two types. I think there's a greater variety of human experiences than dominator or partnership. I think it's a it's a higher dimensionality problem than just A or not A.
I mean, if you follow Deutsch's and Dawkins' explanation of human culture, which is essentially fragments of information that can affect an individual human's behavior, then it's not even appropriate to approach the idea of culture from an ontological point of view, from this kind of like, let's separate cultures into like these buckets and categorize things like this. It's just like we have, like, in analogous to a gene pool, we have a meme pool, and we have all these fragments of information that are free to move around as long as communication channels open between groups. That information will just move between the groups and undergo mimetic evolution inside of the minds of those people. There is no, like, you can't draw a clean distinction between cultures. As soon as two people interface with one another and they start exchanging information, you have the merging of two cultures.
Yeah, and it follows a competitive evolutionary process. I mean, memes will compete sort of in the minds of people, or with humans as their substrate.
Jokes being the sort of pinnacle example. Jokes compete against one another for the transmission. The probability that they'll be transmitted at a dinner party, joke X versus joke Y. Joke X being more competitive than Y if it's more likely to be told. So, like, McKenna's just entire philosophy is completely vacuous from the ground up to even just like divide the world in this way, just arbitrarily. And of course, it's and the reason why I'm getting so angry about this, Jack, or upset about this, because he's
You're much more worked up over McKenna than I am.
I'm. It's because a hero has been lost for me. I really liked Terrence when he was just a funny-looking man on YouTube saying funny things when I was on acid.
That we listened to when we took acid.
That's Terrence. That's Terrence to me. And reading this book has killed Terrence for me.
For me, yes, Terrence initially existed as this strange, high, reedy voice that we would listen to when we took acid or drank mushroom tea. But he's evolved into something greater for me, that the Terrence mythos has evolved.
See, the reason why I killed it for me is, one, because it's a bunch of bullshit. and two, because he's very moralistic. Like,
he's highly moralistic.
He's divided human culture, like the complex of all the billions of humans that have existed in all the many variations as individuals and throughout their various collective entities of like the societies and stuff that they've lived in over the course of the last hundreds of thousands of years. He's divided all of that into two, like this bright line down the middle, and on one side is all the values that he has, and on the other side is all the things that he doesn't like, and he labels one of them partnership. Like, who doesn't want to be in a partnership society, right? But then the other one he calls a dominator society, a dominator culture. It's like, okay, mate, you're not really like selling me on this one. I'll still listen to him on YouTube though. That's why I'm getting worked up about this point. I'm sorry about the rant.
It's okay. Well, to calm you down, let's discuss the path out of Eden.
Okay.
So you've got Eden. You've got in Algeria on the Tassili Plateau. You have archaeological evidence, and I don't really want to use dates when we discuss these things. Not because I am not a famed internet anthropologist, but because he keeps changing the timeline. The time at which some of these events takes varies by thousands of years in McKenna's telling, and I think it'll just confuse things if we try quoting dates, because they really do differ by thousands of years depending on where in the book you're reading. So you've got rock paintings in Algeria from the Tassili N'Adja Plateau. The way I pronounce that, it will be completely
I'm not going to be able
indecipherable. I apologize, but yeah, that's the best you're getting. From the late Neolithic, that shows a shaman holding in his fists mushrooms. There are mushrooms growing out of his body. And Terrence says, regarding these rock paintings, and the fact that they demonstrate a partnership society predicated upon communion with the matrix of vegetable intelligence through magic mushrooms, he says, the pictorial evidence seems incontrovertible.
Incontrovertible.
So there you go. So we have established this as a partnership society, a late Neolithic partnership society. And again, when I say late Neolithic, this is late Neolithic plus minus thousands of years, because the book is not. That's what makes me a bit suspicious of some of his other historical retellings, because he changes the dates on these things by millennia. Anyway,
what's the margin of error the further you go back in history, right? Like, surely you gotta give him some wiggle room. Like, okay, so he provides two pictures, which we can put in post-production. This is the internet, 2022, baby. They're actually pretty interesting pictures. I am convinced I can see the bee-faced mushroom man. I'd be willing to pay. I'd be willing. I will be willing to concede they look like mushrooms.
Mm-hmm.
They do look. He does look like a mushroom man.
Well, I can bring up something here,
and he's got it again. It is of extreme importance, which is he's got a big dong as well.
Here we go. So,
man, enormous phallus.
For the people watching, I've got some tabs open with pictures of Mushroom Man, and it's a bee-faced shaman kind of guy with mushrooms growing from his body, a big old dong. Other pictures of one man amorously mounting a woman. So it shows that they had lots of group sex. And
some mushroom runners. And this is the one which is harder to pay, which is harder to give credit for, because I don't necessarily like, are they mushroom runners? They've got funny shaped heads. Can you really say that they're mushroom men? Like, it's not clear to me that they're definitely mushroom men.
Well, what is clear to me is that I have a quote from Food of the Gods written down, which says, the pictorial evidence seems incontrovertible. So,
this is true.
I don't know what you're thinking, but relying on...
refuted.
Yeah, you've been refuted.
Lord I concede.
Terrence the shaman says you're wrong. So these rock paintings are from the so-called Roundhead civilization. They're called the Roundhead civilization because of the pictorial style of round heads in the rock paintings, I guess. And these people...
Imagine that's how you and your people are remembered.
What, the mushroom shaman picture?
The round-headed
Terrence McKenna.
civilization by Terrence.
Back
60,000 years, 100,000 years after you live your life, some fucking cooked Californian is using you to justify his kooky theory on human evolution. Those poor people.
Anyway, so in the chapter called Paradise Found, he says that this is Eden. This is the origin of the Eden myth. This is where humanity was cast from, not for eating the apple of knowledge, which is the mushroom. That is what
the mushroom.
The apple of knowledge represents. Were cast out by climate change. The climate change, there weren't as many mushrooms growing, so people left. Where did they go?
Burning too many fossil fuels.
Burning, yeah. So where did they go? Well, fortunately we have Terrence. He found a missing link culture. And in the chapter called A Missing Link Culture, we find out that from where the Roundhead civilization formerly was, they moved to Palestine. The Natufian culture, Terrence notes, suddenly experienced an increase in artistic, cultural, and technological sophistication.
Because they were taking more mushrooms.
Well, he feels it's because that culture came into contact with the Roundhead civilization, who brought with them mushrooms. They brought with them cattle.
So wait, is he saying that that some part of the human immigration occurred before Garden of Eden? So there were some humans out there already, but they weren't hominids yet? Well, they weren't like, they were like proto-humans somewhere.
Been. Well, the Garden
must have
of
been
Eden
proto-humans living in modern-day Israel, hanging out, not yet really humans, and then these fellas, the Roundhead mob, they took mushrooms, went up the Horn of Africa, and got cooked with the proto-Israeli proto-hominids.
Well, McKenna doesn't spell it out. What could have happened? Now, what could have happened is that the Garden of Eden is a corrupted remembrance of the Golden Age. So everyone was taking mushrooms. Some people migrated. They migrated away from this modern Eden. Well, from the former Eden, and formed the Natufian civilization. And
yes, but they'd forgotten.
They forgot the mushrooms, and then
they went through a revival.
They went away, and they went away at the time of some climate change, which stopped the mushrooms growing as abundantly. McKenna thinks that the mushrooms probably were growing because these people had cattle, and the mushrooms grew in the dung of the cattle. And so the Roundheads brought the mushrooms back to the Natufians, and that's why they experienced this increase in artistic, cultural, technological sophistication, and probably also had better visual acuity to appreciate it with. And he says this because
the most stoner theory I've ever heard of anything. This takes the cake.
I'm not delivering this in a nasal American accent, so it probably doesn't work quite as well. It doesn't sound as stoner, but anyway, so the Natufian civilization, post-contact with the Roundhead civilization, was another partnership paradise. That was a partnership society. It lived in close communion with plants. It had a strong, ecstatic, shamanic tradition. Then there was Catalhuyuk. How would you pronounce it? It's in central Anatolia.
Yeah, give us a go.
I just had a go.
The little the little squiggly line under the C makes it a S sound, like Sava.
Okay.
Satal. And then what's the double dot over the U do?
I don't know.
Hegel. Have you seen it? You speak German. You've spoken German.
I don't think
you know
this is
German.
German. I don't speak German.
I'm gonna say Satal Hurluk. Satal Hurluk. I'm butchering it. I don't know. I don't know any of the languages around that. Look, it's in Anatolia, so maybe it was like a obviously. So maybe it's somehow related to Turkish. I can't speak any Turkish, so I don't know.
Anyway, this place is where it's in central Anatolia, and this is the last great partnership civilization.
Why don't we refer to it as just like...
How about we pronounce it differently each time, and maybe at one point we will say it correctly. So, Satal Huyuk,
like that.
Katal Huyuk. We just
Satal Huyuk.
Yeah, it's let's go for a bread.
I assume that there's nobody from this civilization alive anymore, therefore we can't get in trouble for mispronouncing any of their words.
it might be named according to conventions of the current occupants. In which case we definitely can mispronounce it. Anyway. So, this is a place which retains the naturalistic spirit of Roundhead art, so it must have been influenced by the people who were cast out of Eden. And the reason why these partnership civilizations were ultimately undone was because of the fucking Proto-Indo-Europeans from north of the Black Sea who came in riding horses.
Those are your people, Jack. You fucking
My
Dominator.
people with Dominator culture. And despite Dominator culture being evolutionarily inferior to
these
partnership
bloody
civilizations,
Europeans
they
have been
outcompete all
oppressing partnership societies at least since the Upper Paleolithic. This is a long-standing tradition.
I apologise on behalf of the Dominator peoples, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, whom I have a deep connection with.
So he says, and I quote, "I contend that the quote Upper Paleolithic ancestor of which we have no trace," end quote, is the culture of the Tassil and Ashar. I can't pronounce it, sorry. The Natufian culture was a transitional culture. So he's trying to make a missing link argument. The Natufian culture was a transitional culture directly linking the Roundhead culture in Africa to the Satal Huyuk. So there we have those three cultures. And then we have these bloody Indo-Europeans, as usual. Riders. The horse riders coming in, their alcohol and their Dominator culture, and they're going to sort of trample over the mushroom cultures.
Yep. They will, in an evolutionarily inferior way, outcompete the mushroom cultures.
They will set humanity on a course over the next 10 to 20,000 years towards eventually developing nuclear weapons and extracting energy from the chemical bonds in fossilized plant matter.
Yeah, well,
to destroy the world.
Somehow,
these two are linked.
The victory of Dominator civilization has set us on a very dark path. And, I mean, it's for this reason. So,
now, for all of the inventions, such as penicillin and lighting at night.
Perhaps penicillin is in some way a faint reconnection with the vegetable mind, given that it is from a fungus.
This is true.
Beta-lactam
But
antibiotics.
despite all of those things, this is fundamentally dominator culture.
Yeah,
and it will
dominating
end
the bacteria.
either with a whimper or a scream. The way that we're going right now, it's going to be a horrid scream, unless we get back to the mushies.
Exactly. And the fundamental problem is, I quote, without such a visionary relationship to psychedelic extrapheromones that regulate our symbiotic relationship with the plant kingdom, we stand outside of an understanding of planetary purpose.
And here's the teleological thing that Jack was talking about earlier. Somehow, the planet, or I don't know, he says Gaia, or the planet, or like any of the other number of names that people would use to talk of like the Earth Goddess or whatever, the Mother Goddess. That entity has a plan for life on Earth, and has had a plan, as far as we can tell, for the last 3.5 billion years. But in the last like 10 to 20,000 years, has given a little hairless ape some mushies, and for some reason doesn't want that ape to use nuclear weapons or something. I don't know what happens there. Do we understand what the purpose of the goddess mother is?
No, but the goddess mother is this thing that you commune with. You are refreshed by the gnosis of the boundary dissolving plant hallucinogens, the extra pheromones that put you in contact with the transcendent other. And that
I think
keeps
he
you
needs to take the boundary dissolving thing a little bit more seriously. To see that there's no boundary between dominator and partnership cultures. This is something that I think Terrence's ego has constructed.
I wouldn't put it past him. He's intensely moralistic. So, yeah, and he goes on to say that the only way that we can recapture this lost Eden and survive as a species, because he views this as an existential threat. If we continue down this path, we're going to destroy ourselves. We'll destroy the Earth. We'll destroy everything. We need a modern shamanism. He says in the chapter Gaian Holism, the next great step towards a planetary holism is the partial merging of the technologically transformed human world with the archaic matrix of vegetable intelligence that is the transcendent other.
Yes! Yes!
You hear that? Mushroom transhumanism.
Despite all of my reservations and my wavering,
You are convinced.
I feel like doubting Thomas right now. I am returned. Blessed is he who has seen, but even more blessed is he who has not seen and still believes. We are talking about mushroom, psychedelic, transhumanism. You have won me over, Terry. I'm on board with this. We need to iron out a little bit of the argument so that we can get it past a few more people. But if that's the goal, if this is the goal, I'm down.
What do you mean get it past a few people? I think we're doing an admirable job of evangelizing the Terrence gospel. It's
Okay.
I mean,
No,
the
sorry.
pictorial evidence is or seems incontrovertible. What more do you want? He's being pretty clear here. He is right. He's told us.
Incontrovertible.
It's incontrovertible. How about we skip forward a bit in the book, because he goes off and discusses.
Your take? I do want to get your take on though psychedelic mushroom transhumanism.
I'd be all for it if we can have some sort of receptacle full of mushrooms jacked directly into our bloodstream, then
You're like
I'd be all for it.
Except instead of stim packs, it's just psychedelic mushrooms.
Just mushrooms.
Just constant trip.
He talks about why the civilization, the Minoan civilization, was was really mushroom loving. He talks about why pre-Zoroaster Persian civilization was mushroom loving, why the Hindu Vedas are all paeans to Soma, which is probably was at one stage magic mushrooms, but later became, I think, based on harmaline or harmine. We can skip over that stuff. It's kind of him just offering
repetitive
examples of why he's correct.
It's almost as if he's finding facts that reinforce his existing narrative.
He'll say things like on the island
for hundreds of pages.
He'll say things like, on the island of Crete there's no evidence of war for thousands of years because they were all taking mushrooms, and that's just what happens when you take mushrooms. You have a warless society. War. I'm not an archaeologist, so I can't categorically say that wouldn't be the case, but I find it somewhat hard to believe.
Okay, but do you think that if you sat the UN down in New York in their little UN studio, the UN building,
the UN studio,
and you just said, you guys aren't coming out until you all take mushrooms, don't you think the world would be a bit of a better place?
If it were televised, it would at least be a more entertaining place for a few hours.
I think they would hash out some stuff. You want peace in the Middle East? Sit some people down. Get Bibi, and the head of Hamas. Just sit them down. Give them a couple of caps and a couple of caps of shrooms. They'll sort it out, man. They'll come to terms. They'll hug, make up. Peace in the Middle East.
It'd be sick. I don't think Bibi is leading Israel anymore, though. He's out.
No, he's always leading Israel.
Anyway, I would strongly support that. I would strongly support putting acid in the water supply. Dump vats of it into all the dams, supplying a city.
Just crystals of it, just throw it in.
Spike the oceans.
like Epsom salts, but acid.
Anyway, I mean, that's unequivocally a good idea. How about we talk about bad drugs? Because there are bad drugs. Not all drugs are good.
No, not all drugs are good.
Alcohol might be the worst drug.
Well, wife beaters, right? Whenever somebody beats their wife, they have a can of VB in their hand.
Exactly.
VB in one hand, ciggy in the other hand, and just laying into them.
Yeah, well, McKenna says something like wife beating without alcohol is like a circus without lions. It's one naturally.
No, he doesn't say something like that. He literally says that.
Yes, it is a necessary
that was a direct
precondition for marital violence.
So
alcohol.
He doesn't like alcohol. It pumps your ego. It makes you violent, and even though it's a social lubricant, it also leads to deteriorations of linguistic abilities and visual acuity.
Yeah, your visual acuity is impaired. So he makes this point several times that our search for intoxication, that humans seem to like altered conscious states, is a search for the lost Eden and for the magic mushroom. From the chapter Alcohol, from the chapter Alcohol and Honey, he says each intoxicant, each effort to recapture the symbiotic balance of the human-mushroom relationship in the lost African Eden is a paler, more distorted image of the original mystery than the last. So, alcohol has some benefits. I mean, it's some attempt to recapture this lost Eden, and in some ways, our love of it has a silver lining to this very dark cloud, because it does show this innate need to get back to the vegetable matrix. But it
But
is ultimately harmful. He identifies alcohol as the first highly concentrated, purified drug, a synthetic drug, when we distilled it. We in a sense,
this is an important point, because who distilled it? Well, it was
alchemists.
fucking alchemists, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Right? And here's the thing with these bloody alchemists, is that they were trying to they were operating off the correct me if I'm wrong here, Jack, but they were operating off the assumption that there's somehow like that the spirit is is in the material body, and that was their fundamental flaw. So when they were trying to distill these things, like these tinctures and stuff that they were making, and ultimately for the elixir of life, they were, I guess, in a way, doing it under a perverted premise. So Terry does not like the alchemists.
No, what they started was this terrible trend of decontextualizing drugs. So before the isolation of spirits, he seems to be. Of course, alcohol is a pale imitation of magic mushrooms or of the psychedelic experience in general. But
like alcoholic honey, like mead.
Yeah, like mead.
And early grapes.
It has some link to the natural world, but when you make a synthetic drug, when you isolate the alcohol from that, you decontextualize it and you strip its ability to reconnect you
concentrating with
ethanol, the great goddess. He
and
says
making straight up spirits like brandy and shit.
Yeah. He says, just as heroin addiction was the malignant flower that sprang from the relatively benign habit of opium use, so distilled alcohol changed the sacred out of the brewer and the vintner into a profane economic engine for the consumption of human hopes. That's quite a denunciation.
Yeah. So, and he extends that logic to all synthetic drugs, except does he apply to acid?
LSD. No, he's a big fan of LSD. So that's an okay synthetic drug.
Okay, so Hoffman nailed it with LSD. All the other synthetics, crack cocaine, heroin, so opium, mate,
relatively benign.
You're okay. Relatively benign. Distill opium and inject it. You're out.
Which is interesting because he talks about the opium wars between the British Empire and China as really bad things, which, at least to my understanding, they were terrible. But
they're pretty bad.
Yeah, they're terrible. But he then also says that opium is relatively benign. And you think, well, I mean, you can have one or the other. You can have opium wars were really terrible.
No.
Opium is relatively benign.
The pictorial evidence seems incontrovertible, Jack.
I see. I see where you're coming from. This is what I mean. He says a lot of things in this book, and many of them don't work together.
He says a lot of things. It's almost as if
he took too many drugs.
He took a lot of psychedelics throughout his life and didn't really have anybody around him who wanted to call him out on his nonsense. I think a person like this only becomes the person he is because he never, I bet you he never ever he's always just surrounded by people who agreed with him.
Yeah, he was probably surrounded by other wake and bake types.
I don't think he. Yeah, and he.
No one pulled him aside and said, "All right, Terrence, just calm it down a bit."
Just, mate, come on, man. You haven't been to work in 3 weeks.
So you purify alcohol. You make the first synthetic drug.
Yeah.
What does it do? Alcohol is the dominator drug. At moderate doses, it increases the libido, which is a good thing. Like magic mushrooms, that could lead to group sex. But the ego feels empowered rather than being dissolved. Yeah. You don't heed social boundaries to the same extent, which, like mushrooms, might be a good thing. you get the impression of improved verbal fluency. However, that's an illusion. You become less articulate. These things are followed by a narrowing of awareness, the reduced ability to respond to social cues. I'm not sure why he said that, because he listed it before. Reduced heating of social boundaries is a really good thing, but hey, it's Terrence McKenna. And an infantile regression into loss of sexual performance. To quote. You also lose motor
you
control,
become
you
impotent.
lose self-esteem.
Me, Mushy McKenna, I'm hard all night, baby.
Yeah, Chad Alpha Dog, Terrence McKenna. Not
you
poisoning his
drink
body
too
with
much.
spirits.
Little wife-beating, VB drinking little bitch. You're a little impotent dick. That's what's happening, all right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but yet still, the Dominator society and the Dominator drug is still the dominant culture on the face of the planet. Nonetheless.
And it's interesting. So, he analyzes why European civilization in particular accepted alcohol. Because on the face of it, you would say, well, European civilization is quite puritanical when it comes to altered conscious states. And alcohol produces an obviously altered conscious state. And one that's bad for society, and people get violent, people's visual acuity is diminished, and their verbal fluency is substandard. So why is it tolerated? Well, he sees it as, so European civilization is deeply, deeply sexually repressed. And what alcohol does is that it allows the indulging of restricted sexual activity, or the ability to let loose sexually in a way that doesn't entail any social responsibility.
Yeah.
Because as we know in our society, if you get drunk and do something stupid, everyone lets you off for it. No one judges you.
Oh, you ran over a 4-year-old and you were drunk?
No worries.
Mate, that's fine. No worries, mate. What are you going to do? You fucking had a few tinnies, mate.
Yeah, you get drunk, someone sexually harasses someone. In our society, that's cool.
It's fine.
You drank alcohol. No one's going to care. You're not getting Me Too'd. You're right.
Sounds like a good Friday night.
Yeah, exactly. So that is why European civilization has tolerated alcohol and embraced it. It's some sort of escape valve for the pent-up sexual pressures of such a neurotic and sexually repressed society. And I would say it. I mean, it's not reflected. I mean, if you get drunk and do something dumb, you get in trouble. It's not a get out of jail free card in our society. I don't know what he's talking about. It's just not true.
And so the fundamental issue. Sorry, not the fundamental issue. There's a lot of fundamental issues of this guy's point of view. But one of the issues is that he is applying this moralistic categorization of alcohol, especially distilled alcoholic spirits and stuff, in a way that it's almost like it's a pharmacological trait of the drug. Like these social outcomes, in much the same way that people like Harry Anslinger, who he criticizes later in the book. Harry Anslinger was one of the early drug prohibitionists in the US who violently repressed heroin and people using heroin and cannabis and that sort of thing. Horrible guy.
Not going to defend him.
Nobody's defending Harry Anslinger except Jack. Right.
Staunch drug prohibitionist that I am.
However, the logic that Anslinger and modern day equivalents, although there's no real equivalent, but modern day people who are prohibitionists talk about, say, marijuana, or talk about cocaine, for example. Let's even take cocaine. Like cocaine, as if the negative effects of cocaine are inherent to the drug itself. Like, yet McKenna, and you see this a lot, I have seen this a lot in the pro-drug people that I know, where they make the same moralistic negation of the drugs that they don't like. So if they don't like alcohol, they'll use that same logic against alcohol, or caffeine against caffeine. And it's exactly the same. So they're just prohibitionists, but they're prohibitionists in against the drugs that they don't like. Mm-hmm. So McKenna is not fundamentally like using like consistent yardstick here. He's just saying, I have these moral interpretations of the world, and therefore I would like to like legalize and resurrect, like do archaic revival using mushrooms, and but get rid of television and alcohol.
Yeah, pretty much. What about you mentioned cannabis? He's quite a fan of cannabis. He
fucking kidding me, mate? Look at him.
I probably don't need to say that. I'm sure people could infer that he likes it, but he really likes it. Because
really
it undermines.
There's a great video of him talking about his first descent into the Amazon. He talks about it on YouTube, and he talks about like taking the mushies before they get to the ayahuasca place, and he talks about taking a massive bomb ass hit. He literally says a bomb ass hit of hashish, and woo. Yeah, he likes it. He likes it a lot.
So he compares it to caffeine. So caffeine he doesn't like much because it reinforces industriousness, competitiveness, wakefulness, things that reinforce dominator society, as opposed to cannabis, which he says is totally safe. There is no scientific reason why you would restrict its use, which
heals your cancer, gets rid of fetal alcohol syndrome, and
which while I
give you a big
I
dick.
think it should be legal, but I also don't think we should pretend that it's good for you. It's not.
It gets rid of epilepsy. It gets rid of cancer. Gets rid of
my glaucoma.
This
is one you hear a lot.
Helps with my glaucoma. Gets rid of death. It will stop you from dying.
Cures death. Yeah. But he likes it because it undermines these precepts of dominator culture. I've got a few quotes where he talks about it. So he says, of all the pandemic plant intoxicants inhabiting the earth, cannabis is second only to mushrooms in its promotion of the social values and sensory ratios that typified the original partnership societies, and hence why cannabis use is so persecuted, despite it being so incredibly safe. Especially when you compare it to
incredibly good.
And then he says, and this is back to my point earlier about the people who make smoking pot into their lifestyle. He is reaching out to these people right now. Because of its subliminally psychedelic effect, cannabis, when pursued as a lifestyle, places a person in intuitive contact with less goal-oriented and less competitive behaviour patterns. And because of this, we should legalize weed. We should free the weed. And
he's literally just saying,
I agree with that quote.
Like,
I think, if you smoke a lot of it,
it
will turn into a fucking vegetable. That's just not a good thing.
If you do smoke enough of it, you will not have as many goals in your life.
I can't disagree with that.
I've experienced that personally, where when I did have a period of time where I was smoking a lot of weed, it did affect my goal-setting capacities.
Fortunately, I never got into weed, so I can't speak from personal experience.
Mate,
I never found it that.
Shut the fuck up, you Dominator fucking piece of shit. Yeah, like he's saying, like, look, I like weed. I reckon we should at least be having a decriminalization conversation, right? However, saying that it makes you like less goal oriented and essentially like less productive is like not the best rhetoric for the case of weed.
But
it'll make you less
within
competitive, less productive, and less goal oriented.
But exactly within the paradigm of Terrence McKenna thought, that's it. Those are good things.
I feel like there was nothing special about his psychedelic and his marijuana experiences. I feel like he probably just had the same experiences that everybody else did. However, he was just kind of zany enough and morally righteous enough to interpret this as like, this is something the world needs.
Yeah, this should be a lifestyle. He also has this good section on why. So the cannabis plant undermines dominator culture, and because everything is so binary in Terrence land, that means it reinforces femininity, which does beg the question, does then femininity entail being less goal-oriented and being less motivated?
No. You're using too much logic there, Jack.
He then also points out that this has a very profound basis. It's cannabis's how closely tied it is to femininity, in that you only care about female cannabis plants because they're the ones that make the psychoactive resin. Male plants don't do that. They're shit. And if male plants come into contact with female plants, the female plants stop making the resin and start making seeds. So it's pure femininity. You eliminate the male. That's not the good bit. You just want the female. It is pure female spirit.
I think Terrence would like the Scum Manifesto. So here's the issue, right? Is that the equivocation between our human kind of cultural archetypes, quote unquote, even that entire concept of archetypes is...
He takes a very rigid
questionable
view of what men and women should be.
Or even the existence of archetypes is questionable. What does it even mean? So,
well, if you're a woman, it means
putting
smoking weed and taking shrooms. That's the most thing you can do.
And chatting with your girls and having orgies. So, like, how do I put this? He's basically saying that archetype somehow is biological of origin. Yeah. It's so deeply biological in origin that it actually extends all the way to plants. So
for someone who states that they want to undermine gender stereotypes, he really tries his hardest to reinforce them in a fairly non-traditional way, but he does tend to reinforce fairly traditional gender stereotypes.
He's inventive with his gender stereotypes and with his
I'll give him that.
He thinks this goes so far back in the evolutionary tree. You have to go back
to cannabis.
The common ancestor between humans and cannabis plants must have had, therefore, a cultural archetype of the feminine and the masculine that conformed and that made the bodies of all the descendants of those two branches of the evolutionary tree conform to that archetype.
I mean, it's amazing. I mean, the pictorial evidence seems incontrovertible.
3 billion. So we're talking, how long ago was that? Like 2 billion years ago, 3 billion years ago or something? The last common ancestor between plants and animals.
It's deep. It's deep. You can't escape it.
It's that deep. However, we do still need to break down these gender roles.
Despite the fact that, on one hand, on reading McKenna, you think, well, these are so fundamental and natural and we need to be acting in accordance with nature. But on the other hand, we're told that we need to break them down anyway because that is itself fundamental and natural. It's hard to know what to think sometimes when you read McKenna, but you do know one thing. You do know that you've got to believe.
You do know that the pictorial evidence seems
incontrovertible. He also has this section, do you remember, about how cannabis, of course, the prime mover of human linguistic evolution and narrative evolution was Stropharia cubensis.
Oh yes.
The foundational,
the initial cause.
But cannabis probably helped us on the way because hemp is a wonderful material for making cloth. As anyone who's taken up marijuana as a lifestyle will tell you within 30 seconds of meeting you, hemp is really special as a cloth.
You might even say that potentially it could have been a competitor to linen or cotton, or its pulp could have been a superior form of paper to standard wood pulp. And then, in fact, we should be using hemp for everything if we were not for certain nefarious groups suppressing.
Oh, we'll get onto the conspiracy
the widespread adoption.
I haven't even approached that bit. We'll get there. Or how in English we have metaphors for stories involving cloth and weaving. So you weave a story or unravel an incident, spin a yarn, stitch together an excuse. You lies are from whole cloth. This obviously means that cannabis helped us in our narrative capacity, because why else would we have these metaphors if not for the fact that the hemp plant can get us high and can be used to make textiles? Yeah,
I think this is true. Yeah.
I think,
He says, does this shared vocabulary reflect an ancient connection between the intoxicating hemp plant and the intellectual processes that lay behind the discovery of the art of weaving and of storytelling? I suggest that such may well be the case.
And this is typical McKenna, where he phrases it that, oh well, I'm being measured here. The scales of justice tip in no particular direction. I'm just positing this theory. But then immediately after, he just acts as if it's an established fact. It's incontrovertible evidence.
This is how you can tell he has a higher education degree, is that
he knows how to make it seem like he doesn't have an opinion.
And he knows how to pick and choose his evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And he writes well enough to make you think that maybe he's making a valid point.
Mm-hmm.
But in particular, he uses this technique, I suppose, and he must have picked this up. I feel like he must have done debating in high school or something. Because you see this technique of him, does this shared vocabulary reflect blah, 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 blah? Like, he'll raise this question, like this kind of innocuous question, and he doesn't, sometimes he like answers it, like even this, he doesn't answer it super strongly, but he's kind of like leading you, the reader, to like, oh, well, infer that, oh yeah, like, or he doesn't give you like an alternative question to ask. It's this very like underhanded rhetorical device that he uses again and again and again.
Yeah.
And it gives him this get out of jail free card to not really directly say it, but he is saying it.
I was just asking a question.
I'm just asking a question.
He's doing a sneaky McKenna. So anyway, so cannabis and hash are really good and are an imitation of the magic mushroom, but still pretty good. Alcohol is terrible and leads to hatred of women. It does beg the question though. So say Saudi Arabia, where you can't drink and has a history of not letting people drink alcohol, but also in the region
treats their women
people smoke hash.
equitably.
And Saudi Arabia is not a beacon of women's rights. I mean, I think they're allowed to drive now, which was
sounds like Western Dominator culture to me.
Yeah, maybe that's the problem. It was a paradise for women, but
you Islamophobic Western piece of shit.
Exactly. Well, I suppose Islam is monotheistic and McKenna hates monotheism. So maybe that's the problem. Maybe it's just innate to all monotheism. It's you just hate women.
Yeah, okay, so does the monotheism, and especially it's in the Judeo-Christian family, right? So I don't know, does he want to, are we going to lump them, all three of them together and just say this?
I think so. I think he only really goes after Christianity.
He goes after Christianity. Oh no, okay. Shout out to Terry McKenna, least anti-Semitic person we've done so far.
Yeah, actually, he never went after Jewish people.
Not anti-Semitic at all.
Which
not a single moment, even in his conspiracy theories, never once.
Never came up.
Never comes up. He is even partial to the idea that the Holocaust happened.
Yeah, and this might sound like extremely faint praise, but if anyone has listened to any of our previous episodes, pretty much everything we've read so far has blamed Jews for something.
Deeply anti-Semitic.
I'm not sure actually if the Unabomber
I don't
was
think.
an
I feel like.
I don't think he
was
did.
he Jewish? No, he was Polish, right?
Yeah,
of Polish descent. But he might have been Jewish.
I don't know.
I
don't know, well. But at least he didn't seem anti-Semitic. So there's someone else.
Once brought up people being Jewish, but 3 out of 4 so far. So Terrence McKenna is on the same level as the Unabomber
in terms of not being an anti-Semite. Yeah, you're right. Actually, that is something very positive about Terrence McKenna that we should acknowledge.
Now, one point that Terry has over Ted is that
he didn't murder anyone.
I'm glad he didn't murder anyone, nor was he murderous.
No.
At no point in this book does Terrence McKenna advocate for the use of child soldiers or nuclear holocaust or stab anybody.
No, that was something quite nice about
argue
reading
for the new golden age of piracy.
Yeah, it was nice reading this because he doesn't advocate for genocide. He's not an anti-Semite. He doesn't want to hurt anyone. He's very peaceful. He's intensely moralistic, but not violently so.
So on that level, shout out to Terry.
Shout out to Terry for not being an anti-Semite.
He's just he's just a zany hippie with some weird eccentric points of view, and he took a lot of psychedelics throughout his life. But he's not like fundamentally a bad person.
He's not hateful.
And he's not hateful, and he's not full of like rage and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like if you met him at a party, he'd probably be quite condescending if you ate meat or anything like that.
He doesn't. I wonder whether he was vegetarian or vegan, because he does describe the burnout diet of the modern Western man as composed of alcohol, sugar, and red meat.
I assume he only ate mushrooms.
Yeah, he was a mycovore. While we're on the topic of praising Terrence McKenna, I did just come across a quote of his that I quite liked. He says, "Yet, as a society, we are not ready to discuss the possibility of self-managed addictions and the possibility of intelligently choosing the plants we ally ourselves to. In time, and perhaps out of desperation, this will come." I quite like the idea of trusting people enough to manage which plants they choose to take or not.
Are you saying that you think that people are essentially sovereign citizens over their own bodies and they should be allowed to enter into political alliances with whichever plants they choose?
With whichever plants they choose. I think with certain restrictions. I mean, we probably shouldn't be selling heroin in a 7-Eleven, but it should be more free than it currently is.
That's extremely regressive. You fucking Tory. You Tory.
Tory. I don't believe in selling fentanyl to 5-year-olds outside of a primary school. Jack the arch conservative
from like the vending machine in the hallway at the school. So yeah, no, he's. I actually got more angry about Terrence than I did about any of the other books.
I found this the easiest thing that we've read.
But he's definitely the least hateful person.
There's not much hate. There's not much.
Just
He
a bit of
does well.
condescension.
I mean, he hates how the West operates, and he has that
hates
very
the West
he has that very
in an
classic
abstract way.
tertiary educated middle class Westerner view of how the West is uniquely bad in everything, and every other culture is in
he's a
some ways
self-hating Westerner.
better, particularly those that are less technologically advanced. He has this real noble savage
A real noble savage
idea,
complex, yeah.
and that kind of thing, it comes across as extremely condescending and irritating. But as far as it goes, as far as the things we have read for this podcast, that's okay. I can deal with that.
Yeah, I suppose it's better than like racialist, like social Darwinism.
Yeah, and racial.
Yeah, so is there anything... What were we talking about before we started praising him?
I forget, but we could move on to the West and the problems in the West and why we are at the stage that we are now. Because when he discusses the modern condition, he only discusses the West. The West is terrible because it sees its dominator values as universal, but then Terrence McKenna goes on to pretty much exclusively discuss the modern world in terms of the West.
Now, this was published in 92, right? So there were, it's not like there weren't other parts of the world that he could have looked at as alternatives to the West, such as the Soviet Union or Maoist, I don't think, or like China, communist China, or like the various like
Just
despotic
the rest
regimes.
of the world.
The rest of the world. No, he just kind of like just says the West, horrible, dominators, and then there's the shamanistic cultures, and there's no
years ago. And nothing else exists.
or modern versions of the shamanistic cultures, and there's nothing else. There's just the West, which I assume he basically is thinking the US.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as we all know, in the 90s, East Asia hadn't been invented yet. It just didn't exist. Just popped into existence one day after Terrence wrote Food of the Gods. Hence why he doesn't mention it.
He does this classical, this classic, like, I would say, like, leftist, in my experience, like, leftist equivocation of the quote-unquote the West with everything they don't like. In the same way that you could say, like, people just say, like, oh, this thing is so capitalist. It's just this, like, stand-in generic term that people use for, like, things that they don't like about the world. And so that could be, like, you know, there's some issue around, like, oh, I don't like this conservative policy, or, like, anything like that. It's a very generic stand-in term for just, like, things that I don't like. And but it's vitriol directed towards Western civilization as such, in a very sort of non-specific way, and it does not take any. It's extremely binary, and it doesn't look at any. It makes no concessions. There's nothing good about, like, there's nothing good out of the West. Not manned flight, like humans flying, no, not good. Like electricity, electromagnetism, no, not good. Like modern biomedical medicines, no, not good. Like none of it's good. Like the ability to peacefully remove rulers from power without having to go through a violent revolution, no, not good. The West is just bad. It's Dominator. It just blows people up and creates nukes, and that's it.
Yeah, which... It's a very navel gazing view of the world, because it's mostly university educated whites talking about why the world is so bad because white people or the West have ruined everything. But when people like that talk in that way, I often get the feeling that they seem to only ascribe free will to white people. Like everything else in the world is passive and exists to be acted upon by whites
By the
living in
West.
Western countries.
By wealthy, and not even whites in general. It's inevitably by upper middle class whites and upper class and the political class and the business and not the small business class, the corporate like multinational class. There's these nefarious classes or strata even within Western or white culture that they have all the power and all the capacity to do whatever they want and just rape and pillage and dominate the rest of the world. And if any other person from any other cultural background or any other quote-unquote class does anything, step outside the boundary, say, for example, an African person starting a business and becoming wealthy, that's like not even considered, and it could even, or if it is considered, it's like seen as like some sort of like
Acting
fall
white.
from grace, acting white or whatever. And it's like, what is this like horrible zero sum like combative view of the world? It's so simplistic, it's so juvenile.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Lord Terrence does fall into that trap quite often. When I say fall into the trap, he embraces it to the fullest.
Yeah,
He loves it.
Other than that one issue, pretty much the rest of the text is perfect.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes.
That's our only concern.
It's an unimpeachable text. These are little quibbles around the margins.
Is there much else to say about the Western thing? He basically he's just it's fucking. Anyways,
there are a number of addictions to drugs, and when I say drugs, remember this is drugs in the Terrence McKenna very broad sense that started in the West and then have basically been exported to the rest of the world from the West.
Yeah.
Because it started in medieval Europe, which was so starved of variety that as soon as they came across spices and dyes from other countries, they went bananas and dedicated enormous resources to developing technology for trade so that they could get these things to increase stimulation. So we in our current life, and I say, in Australia, we live lives of abundant stimuli with high definition screens, the internet, we have alcohol, we have colours everywhere, we have food with spices,
we have
things
Reddit.
Like that. And this level of stimulation is like a drug. And taking it away is almost like withdrawing from a drug. It's painful. And so this was the situation that medieval Europe was in. So as soon as they had some sort of something that could stimulate them, they went bananas for it.
So they were deprived.
They were deprived.
So they just had like bags, but like cloth bags as clothing. Everything was grayscale, as in literally everything was grayscale. Mm-hmm. And then when dyes from India entered into the landmass of Europe, it was like that scene in what was it, Alice in Wonderland, where like it becomes Technicolor. That was spice and dyes from India entering Europe, and all the Europeans saw color for the first time.
Yeah, now he's got this quote from the chapter called
and then
"Enter
starts
Sugar,"
smoking opium,
which is a harmless habit, as he said earlier.
So good.
Benign. He says, our present global trading system was created to cater to people's inherent need for variety and stimulation. It did this with a single-minded intensity that brooked no interference from the church or the state. Neither moral scruples nor physical barriers were able to stand in its way. So, deprived of stimulation, medieval Europe went all in on trying to get stimulation, hence the technological advancement. One of the things that was most harmful
react to that
is when they discovered sugar. And Terrence regards sugar as maybe second to alcohol, the worst drug. He ties sugar tightly to slavery. He says much slavery existed to get sugar, and I'm not going to dispute that. That's a that's true. Terrence McKenna said it. That doesn't make it untrue.
No, he does. Look, Terrence does say stuff that is factually true at times.
He does hit on factual truth.
Whether or not that inherently kind of instills within sugar some sort of moral valence now that we don't get our sugar from slavery.
I don't think,
is a different issue.
That doesn't morally valence sugar. But he says...
Like into the indefinite future, now that the original history of sugar was slavery.
He talks about sugar addicts, and he says, after alcohol and tobacco, sugar is the most damaging addictive substance consumed by human beings. And the level of sugar in our diets today, at least in the West, is one of the major factors driving the very, very high levels of obesity and type 2 diabetes. It is, in the quantities that most people consume,
100%
damaging to your health. It's not.
He makes a good point here. Again, he makes there's a part around the end of the book where he makes like, I mean, most of you just read it like, okay, fair enough, like whatever. Mm-hmm. Like sugar sucks. Yeah, sugar's bad for you.
Yeah.
Or like too much. At least too much sugar is bad for you.
Yeah. He says that you don't get anything from it that you can't get from other sources. That we survived before eating refined sucrose from sugarcane. It's true. He says,
sure, but you could say that. You could say that about any class of nutrient. You could say that about anything. You could say, oh well, we don't need farm-bred meat. We could get the same protein from soybeans or whatever. You just like pick your food. You can be like, you can substitute it with a different food. So why should you eat it?
Yeah, I agree. I think sugar has a very sordid history, and the way it's consumed today is damaging to your health. But the argument that you can get anything you get from
it's an absolute
could be applied to pretty much any food, except magic mushrooms.
As this book has laid out.
Yeah, and
incontrovertibly.
And so now the drugs that we are consuming in society, he also talks about caffeine, so tea and coffee being brought in and being used as drugs.
Industrial dominator drugs.
And sugar and alcohol. These industrial dominator drugs. He says, the stage is then set for the evolution of a human self-image that is entirely disensouled, adrift in a dead universe devoid of meaning and without moral compass. Organic cosmos is rendered meaningless. This process of deepening cultural psychosis, an obsession with ego, money, and the sugar/alcohol drug complex, reaches its culmination in the mid-20th century with Sartre's appalling assertion that nature is mute. He then goes on to say, nature is not mute, but modern man is deaf. Made deaf because he is unwilling to hear the message of caring balance and cooperation that is nature's message. So we are fundamentally trying to recapture the communion with nature that we got from magic mushrooms through drug use, but now we are using sugar and alcohol. So we're really in trouble. That is why the world is so terrible now, that we are disensouled, adrift, unconnected to vegetable gnosis.
Checks out.
No? Sounds good. And then it gets worse. I mean, things get worse from there. So, as you remember from him talking about alcohol, how, say, mead from fermenting honey was good because it has some connection to nature and to the transcendent other. But as soon as you distill the alcohol, then you've removed it from that context. We've done the same with opium, that relatively benign habit of taking opium, with two things: with the isolation from opium of morphine. So we've made a synthetic hard drug from it, and then the invention of the hypodermic syringe. We made morphine, and then that became heroin, this super addictive hard drug, disensouled, removed from the vegetable matrix, from the relation
and
to
removed
nature.
from the social context of
Yeah,
like, why
and we
you
did
would
the
use
same
it.
thing with cocaine. So there's the coca plant.
And you can
that
see
is
the
used as a
synthetic,
stimulant.
the modern synthesis and isolation regime of like modern pharmacology is a direct derivative, historical extrapolation of the alchemist, right? Distilling the spirits and stripping these drugs of like their social context and of the enveloping like plant matter.
Yeah. And then he ascribes to them a new context. He says of heroin here, heroin is the perfect drug for anyone who has been damaged by lack of self-esteem or traumatized by historic upheaval. It is a drug of battlefields, concentration camps, cancer wards, prisons and ghettos. It is the drug of the resigned and the dissolute, the surely dying and the victims unwilling or unable to fight back.
Yeah,
Which is not...
it's a historicist argument. Yeah, it's an interesting point. Like like a lot of people, how like let's get the correct causal like relationship here. And look, I'm not a public health expert, so what I say right next is like obviously dubious, but yeah, okay. I don't necessarily know if it's the case that a lot of people who are traumatized do use whatever self-medicating drugs such as heroin. However, a lot of people who use things like heroin or whatever drug, pick your drug of addiction, a lot of people who use those drugs have got trauma. So, and they're self-medicating. At least that's some non-trivial proportion of people doing that. So that's an interesting point that he makes.
That point is not without merit. I think there is something to the oblivion offered by opioids that would appeal to someone who's trying to escape trauma.
Yeah, and probably also like ice, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably to. I mean, maybe to some degree, but then again, like, why doesn't he use that same like thinking with alcohol? Like, I think a lot of people who drink a lot are drinking to like self-medicate. So, like in the experience of the people who I've met who have got alcoholism problems, like they seem like they're medicating themselves. So, I don't know. Like he has this kind of so point well taken. However, he doesn't like think, hey, maybe this applies to alcohol as well, or like whatever.
Yeah, I guess maybe he discusses these things with respect to what he regards as hard drugs or isolated drugs. So maybe it could be applied to alcohol as well if it's distilled alcohol.
If you're just
then
taking
wonder though, like,
shots
would it apply
of
to an
lab
alcoholic?
ethanol, if you're just squirting lab ethanol in your eyeball,
Yeah,
then
would it
it's
apply
okay.
to an alcoholic drinking wine, say? Which is not
Or
a
do they
distilled
have to be doing shots of vodka?
Yeah.
Well, this is why even that demarcation between synthetic and non-synthetic, or natural and unnatural, or whatever. Like, and it's not just McKenna who makes this line in the sand. Like other people who are in like the drug reform scene, I've heard it made plenty of times, and at least to me, like it's a non sequitur. It's like it's beside the point whether or not you happen to have it, like in the context of like the fiber and the cellulose and the other chemicals of like the plant matter, or if you extract the active ingredient. Like,
What about the newest drug, or at least when he was writing, television?
Oh, well.
No, I'm talking about the
That's
bad
clearly-
one. He mentions MDMA sort of offhandedly, which I was surprised by. I would have thought MDMA would really appeal to someone like him.
Yeah, I don't know how big it was back then. Although it was in the 90s, man. It was popping off in the 90s.
Yeah,
And
he
apparently the
definitely would have been aware
MDMA
of
they had in the 90s in like Europe and stuff was like crazy. It's like crazy good. Yeah, he would have been aware of it for sure. In fact, I'm sure he probably took it. Yeah, he doesn't really talk about it.
But he says of television, he compares TV to heroin, in that the user of TV doesn't care about the outside world very much. They become apathetic. And they're only
Would you say that
vaguely aware
it
of
reduces your proclivity to set goals?
Probably, which would be a good thing. But he says, not unlike drugs or alcohol, the television experience allows the participant to blot out the real world and enter into a pleasurable and passive mental state. And one of his major problems is that this is a designer
taking mushrooms.
space. But it's a designer space in that it's been designed by, he used examples like people in Madison Avenue, by people in Wall Street, people in the Pentagon, people in the White House.
Yes.
They have designed
people
this
at the
mental place for you to reinforce their agenda and what they want you to think. Capital T, they.
Now, this might be the only place that he might be subtly sneaking in some anti-Semitism, but I'll give him the benefit of the doubt.
No, he never blamed
that.
Jewish
By
people.
capital T, they, he does not mean a cabal of Jewish elders. I think he just means a kind of bureaucratic they that is non-culturally specific, culturally non-specific.
I will be generous.
But if there was ever a place,
I don't think
he could have snuck it in there.
He could, but that doesn't mean he does. I'm going to be nice to Terrence. I don't think.
In the original manuscript, he put a Star of David next to
it. He's got this other quote about. So, we're going to get into conspiracy theory land here. Although we've been skirting on its edge for the entire podcast.
Truth land.
He believes that Western governments, and particularly the intelligence agencies, they not only tolerate but they participate in the illicit drug trade. So he says that of say the cocaine and crack cocaine epidemics. He says, later during the 1960s, the Central Intelligence Agency would use the same technique to smother political dissent in American black ghettos under an avalanche of number 4 China White, heroin of extraordinary purity. Oh, sorry, discussing heroin. He then later blames the CIA for crack. So he's saying that the CIA uses addiction to hard drugs to keep certain communities pliable and easily controlled. He says, he also says, involvement in and indeed domination of the world narcotics trade has proven irresistible to groups such as the CIA, Opus Dei, and the French Secret Service. I mean, I'm not sure why a branch of the Catholic Church is involved in international drug smuggling, but there you go. It is.
I am not going to vouch for the historical accuracy of anything that Terrence said or that I'm about to say. However, has it come to light that the CIA was like meddling with like cocaine stuff in Central and South America?
I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me. That's, I
It
mean,
wouldn't.
I'm not
don't
going to
know
say
if
they
this
did, but
is
it wouldn't
true.
surprise me.
I wouldn't be surprised though. Now, whether or not that is a systematic issue or that it was endemic or that it was like authorized from a part, like a reasonably high, ranking part of the CIA, such that you could say that like it wasn't just like some rogue actors or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Like you'd have to pick it apart. The other stuff about like the government actively fanning social decay in, say, Hispanic or Black American communities by facilitating or allowing or actively authorizing the sale of narcotics such as crack cocaine or heroin into those communities. I can't say whether or not that's true. I don't know.
It also wouldn't surprise me.
an extremely cynical, default perspective is that I wouldn't put it past the US government to have done things like that to their own people.
Yeah, it's not evidence, but
I don't know if they actually did.
It wouldn't come as a huge shock.
So...
Yeah, and he was really scared of this huge confluence of events. So you're poisoning certain communities with these hard drugs, and then using TV as an electronic drug to control the minds of others, keeping people sick.
He's got this
sugar.
Nice quote.
He viewed this as a descent of fascism.
Television, while chemically non-invasive, nevertheless is every bit as addicting and physiologically damaging as any other drug.
Yeah. There's this great quote that sums up this whole command and control drug policy on behalf of the US government, which is, flattening, editing, and simplifying, television did its job and created a post-war American culture of the Ken and Barbie variety. The children of Ken and Barbie briefly broke out of the television intoxication in the mid-60s through the use of hallucinogens. Oops, responded the Dominators, and they quickly made psychedelics illegal and halted all research. A double dose of TV therapy plus cocaine was ordered up for the errant hippies, and they were quickly cured and turned into consumption-oriented yuppies. That's a really good one.
Case closed.
Case closed.
That's it. You can really... you can hear the like... how would you say? Not venom, but like resentment or something in that one.
Yeah. How about, because the podcast is getting pretty long, how about we get to what he says we should do?
Yep. Is there anything else to say about any of the other stuff? Oh, okay. So I think we should just read that list. We can skip the history of psychedelics.
Yeah, he then talks about all the different types of psychedelics. He talks about DMT being a portal to connect with some sort of natural overmind, which I assume to be the transcendent other.
Do you want to talk about the modest proposal?
Let's talk about, he's got a section at the end called A Modest Proposal, which is a 9-point
Do we want to
plan.
go one and then the other?
Yeah.
Okay. You explain the proposal.
Yeah. He's got this 9-point plan called A Modest Proposal to get back to an archaic society, or to help along the archaic revival. A lot of stuff before this are just kind of trip reports. So the first point,
pretty fun,
in this plan: 200% federal tax on tobacco and alcohol, end tobacco production subsidies, warnings on tobacco packaging, a 20% tax on sugar and sugar substitutes, and end sugar subsidies. I should also preface all this by saying he's got a huge amount of wackiness in the rest of the book, and then for his modest proposal, a lot of it is actually quite reasonable. A lot of his proposals I find quite unobjectionable.
So that was proposal 1.
Yeah. So 2.
So curb the use of sugar. So number 2 is all forms of cannabis should be legalized, and a 200% federal sales tax imposed on cannabis products.
Yeah.
So
and to have warnings on the packaging, which
information as to the THC content seems reasonable, and current conclusions regarding its impact on health should be printed on the packaging. Totally reasonable.
Yeah, again, I don't dislike that.
Yeah, I don't know.
The third point, IMF and the World Bank to stop lending to countries producing hard drugs, and they have inspections programs, like say the nuclear inspection programs, to make sure that countries aren't making nuclear weapons. You'll have the same to make sure that they're not making cocaine or heroin or any other.
It's a little bit interventionist,
hard
isn't
drug.
it? But other than that,
yeah. And at the start of the book, he talks about how anyone concerned with freedom would be horrified at the thought of restricting this cornucopia of pharmacological agents to alter the psyche.
Unless it's synthetic cornucopia.
Yeah. When you read McKenna,
arbitrary lines in the sand.
When you read McKenna, you just have to accept a degree of
arbitrariness.
Yeah, arbitrariness. Yeah, and being self-contradictory.
Number four is strict gun control must apply to both manufacture and possession. It is the unrestricted availability of firearms that has made violent crime and the drug abuse problem so intertwined.
Yeah, okay.
I'm against this one. I want to move to Texas and get myself a gun. So
yeah, I think you should be allowed to own a gun, but I do think you should be able to. You should have to pass background checks.
No, none of that. I want fully automatic rifles with
I want
no
to own my own
checks.
nuclear bomb. I'll defend my home by nuking the city if anyone comes near me.
Sovereign citizen.
5. All plants are legal to grow and possess. Yeah. 7. Better currency and...
No, psychedelic therapy should be made legal and insurance coverage extended to include it. I'm so on board with that. I'm so on board. I think that's a totally because
if it weren't apparent from earlier in the podcast, I do like taking psychedelics, so I would I'm on board with that.
Also, like there seems to be some emerging literature showing the efficacy of psychedelic therapy in certain restricted circumstances.
Yeah.
And, it's early days for the science. So it might turn out that there are applications of these things that are like really good for your health. And so, insurance should definitely cover a legitimate treatment for like people's issues. And just because it happens to be psychedelic doesn't mean it should be excluded.
If it means I can vape DMT more easily, then I'm on board.
I think that should be covered by your insurance, Jack.
By my insurance? DMT today. See if Medicare will help me out. Yep.
You were about
7.
to read 7.
Yeah. So stricter currency and banking regulations. He's particularly concerned that the banks are helping fund drug cartels. I think more generally.
Well, they are. They definitely.
Yeah, I mean,
there's been issues with like Swiss Bank and stuff helping out like whatever cartel and shit.
Every 30 seconds, Deutsche Bank is pulled up on funding some sort of illicit activity or having money funneled through it. So yeah, that sounds fine. Yeah, I agree.
Okay. 8. There is an immediate need for massive support for scientific research into all aspects of substance use and abuse, and an equally massive commitment to public education. Again,
yep. I mean, the just say no didn't work. It has never worked. It is not working. It will not work. We need to learn to live with addictive substances rather than try to pretend that they don't exist.
Yeah. Next one.
1 year after implementing steps 1 to 8, all drugs still illegal in the USA to be decriminalized. And the government will sell drugs at cost plus 200%. The money collected will go towards costs of the legalization program. And additionally, there'll be a pardon for all offenders in drug cases which didn't include assault or the use of firearms.
So non-violent drug-related crimes should be essentially like pardoned. Again, I'm totally on board with that. That sounds perfectly reasonable. But
this is the bit where McKenna really does my head in, because the rest of the book, this is in one of the last few pages for listeners. This is right at the end. And the rest of the book is pretty wacky. And then he finishes with this little glimmer of pretty reasonable concrete proposals. Well, it's not hand-waving. He's giving concrete proposals. And I find myself agreeing with most of them, which is a really strange experience, having not agreed with most of what I read previously.
Yeah, essentially he has this really wacky massive 200-page preamble, 300-page preamble to like this otherwise fairly reasonable list of... And I'll read the last paragraph because
please do.
Fairly good. So this is after those 10 demands. and I quote, "If these proposals seem radical, it is only because we have drifted so far from the ideals that were originally most American. At the foundation of the American theory of social polity is the notion that our inalienable rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To pretend that the right to the pursuit of happiness does not include the right to experiment with psychoactive plants and substances is to make an argument that is at best narrow and at worst ignorant and primitive. The only religions that are anything more than the traditionally sanctioned moral codes are religions of trance, dance, ecstasy, and intoxication by hallucinogens. The living fact of the mystery of being is there, and it is an inalienable religious right to be able to approach it on one's own terms. A civilized society would enshrine that principle in law."
Nice. How about
And you know what? Like like certain Native American tribes made the religious argument, like religious rights, religious freedom argument, to be able to legally use peyote, and they won in the Supreme Court, and they do it legally there in like Arizona and stuff. So he's making it like, I don't know, like everything seems fairly reasonable here. But if you just go back to like the first part of the book, you're like, this guy's totally cooked.
Yeah, then there's also, it's questionable whether he seems to be hailing American liberal democratic values as good things, but then also saying that the West is awful, even though that's where those...
Again, completely inconsistent. I don't think that there's many like pre-agricultural societies where they had this idea of like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and like property rights and all these sorts of things, like enshrined in any sort of like codified social institution.
Probably weren't quoting John Locke. How about I can give a quote that I quite liked that he closed the book out on, and then we can talk about our impressions, whether we think we're the crazy ones. So he says in the chapter From the Grasslands to the Starship, "Human history has been a 15,000-year dash from the equilibrium of the African cradle to the 20th century apotheosis of delusion, devastation, and mass death. Now we stand on the brink of starflight, virtual reality technologies, and a revivified shamanism that heralds the abandonment of the monkey body and tribal group that has always been our context. The age of the imagination is dawning." Are we the crazy ones?
Yeah, I think so.
Answered. So when we ask, are we the crazy ones, we're looking for what is the author seeing that we're not. And in the case of Terrence McKenna, I think we can take that question quite literally. What is he seeing, or what did he see that we're not? And clearly he had some trips, saw some things on those trips, and we haven't reached that level yet.
He saw some stuff. He definitely saw some stuff.
Not even in DMT hyperspace have I seen the things that Terrence must have seen.
My only concern is that I do think that you can take too many psychedelics. I don't know where that line is.
But Terrence crossed it.
Terrence fucking crossed that line.
That's a Rubicon he blasted across a long time ago.
He jumped on a goddamn psychedelic jet ski, zipped across it.
Yeah.
With his giant monkey dong. So Terrence, it's a funny mixture. He basically has a crazy 300-page preamble to a fairly reasonable set of proposals for drug reform. Yeah. That's basically fruit of the gods. The last, if you cut out the first 314 pages and you just took that last couple of pages, you could probably like talk to a lot of people and be like, "What do you reckon?" Yeah, and they're like, "Oh yeah, that's probably reasonable in 2022."
Yeah, I mean, he's got that a modest proposal section, which is fairly reasonable. But then the last few pages following that are back to Terrence McKenna weirdness.
Would you like to read any more Terrence McKenna books after this?
No.
Are you sure?
No, I don't.
Because he does have some other books.
He's got a lot
I'm
of
not saying would you
books.
like. I'm not saying would you like to, as if it's something like would you go and do it on your own volition. I'm saying as a part of the show.
As a part of the show, if I were convinced that he said something in those books that he doesn't say in Fruit of the Gods, which I'm not convinced he does,
Okay,
then it
'cause
might
he
be
has a
worth
book
looking
where
into.
he describes novelty theory. Have you not heard of this?
No, please give me a press.
High level overview is basically he extrapolates out the increasing novelty of society into an exponential trend and says we're heading towards this like singularity, exponentiating novelty,
Unpredictable novelty.
Yeah, that he derives from the I Ching, the Chinese sacred book of numbers.
Maybe it will be worth returning to Terrence.
Okay, keep an open mind.
Out of 10, how convincing did you find this book? We've had some pretty low scores on the podcast so far. I think we both gave Varga 1 or something. I think Poseidus got a 2 or a 3.
Well, yeah, we should probably put the scores up somewhere on the website. In my opinion, how convincing. Okay, the thing is that's the issue with the book is I end up agreeing with his last little bit. But I just don't get to his perspective by the same route. So I give him maybe like a 5, I suppose.
I think of it like a maths exam in high school. You remember how you had to show your working and you got marked mostly on the working and not just on writing the right number at the end. And it is exactly what happens with Food of the Gods. So the answer he offers at the end of this is, I agree with most of it. I find it quite compelling, but his working, the 300 plus pages before that point, it's like talking to a stoner. It's like talking to someone whose identity is taking drugs. Which was basically like, it's not an unfair.
Well, that is what
Terrence McKenna, he embraced it.
Literally. No, he completely defined his entire professional identity on that.
Yeah.
That was what he did. He was that guy.
I like aspects of the answer, and I don't like his working. So I'll give him. I agree with you. I think a 5 is pretty fair. He writes pretty well.
He gets points,
and he doesn't. He's not hateful.
Being a horrible writer.
Yeah,
he's
not
fine
boring,
writer.
and he's not
he
hateful.
Clearly went to UC Berkeley. Mm-hmm. He's not full of hate. He's not anti-Semitic.
So he gets points for that. Maybe
I do feel as though reading it like made me a dumber person.
Yes, it certainly has a deadening effect. I didn't feel dirty like I felt when I read Varg, but I did feel a bit slower.
Yep.
So I need to give him a bit of credit for not being hateful and not advocating for killing anyone, which I don't think anyone we've read. I'll give him a 5.5. He gets extra points for.
I also like his YouTube videos, so 6. I reckon that's good. Go and listen to his YouTube videos. He's funny.
That's a very weak praise for Terrence McKenna.
Can we end? Can we end it on anything clean?
Tune in next time. I forget what we're reading. I'll add that in. Oh man, yeah, we are. We're reading
Scum Manifesto, potentially.
Are we reading?
Manifesto. No,
are we reading?
Valentine's.
Are we reading Julius Evola or the Scum Manifesto? Tune in next time to find out.
For
something.
All right.